Eradicating hope. Could the UN's efforts to end AIDS by 2030 be hurting more than helping? Also on today's program, we go inside an Iraqi city liberated from Daesh rule to see what's left. And in Picture This, let the games begin. The Olympic torch arrives in Rio, but not everyone is celebrating. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's the disease coming to define an entire generation. More than 1 million people died from AIDS-related causes last year, and hundreds of thousands more got infected. The UN has vowed to eradicate the disease by 2030, but is it realistic? Many health workers say it's not only ambitious, but possibly counterproductive, as it's fueling complacency and weakening the sense of urgency. And now some experts worry the virus could spiral out of control due to an increase in drug resistance, a jump in new cases, and a decline in funding. Today's Newsmaker is the AIDS epidemic, as we ask if the world needs to rethink its approach to one of the greatest medical crises in history.
It was a dose of bad news for those who thought the end may be in sight. The warning that the world could be losing the fight against AIDS and HIV. The United Nations set a target of 2030 to eradicate the disease. They're now saying this may be over-optimistic. I don't believe that the slogan, "The end of AIDS by 2030, is realistic and it could be counterproductive. No, AIDS is still one of the biggest killers in the world. The words of Professor Peter Pyatt, the Executive Director of UNAIDS. The United Nations say that a long-term decline in the number of new infections in adults had stalled. An estimated 1.9 million adults had become infected with HIV every year for at least the past 5 years. Globally, some 36.7 million are now infected. New HIV infections among adults are rising in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caribbean, the Middle East, as well as North Africa.
I am an optimist. I'm an optimist that we can bring about the end of AIDS. I'm an optimist about the tools. I'm an optimist about the incredible dedication by the people I see here.
There was still optimism in Durban, where experts and donors gathered recently. South Africa held the International AIDS Conference for the first time in 16 years. It became something of a pariah when the then President Thabo Mbeki dismissed the link between the HIV virus and the disease. His health minister touted beetroot and the African potato as remedies for AIDS. It caused hundreds of delegates to walk out of the conference in 2000. But South Africa sits at the epicenter of the world pandemic. 7 million South Africans, 19% of the adult population, live with HIV.
AIDS does not discriminate on its own. It has no biological preference for black bodies, for women's bodies, for gay bodies, for youth or the poor.
A combination of problems are affecting the fight against the epidemic. 2 million people each year are infected, 60% of them girls. While in developing countries, HIV is becoming resistant to the drugs used to treat people. It means other drugs are required, and that means extra money. But when funding is cut back, it becomes difficult. There may be some good news, however. Amidst the maelstrom of the presidential election in the United States, the Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton has released a plan to usher in an AIDS-free generation, promising additional funding at home and abroad, as well as lowering the price of drugs for those living with AIDS or HIV. If, of course, she is elected.
We do have the tools to end this epidemic once and for all, but we need to rededicate ourselves to fighting HIV and AIDS and leaving no one behind.
But the bottom line is that without an effective vaccine, with the epidemic no longer being considered a death sentence, complacency and lack of sex education may be the main obstacles in the fight against the disease. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Geneva is Kevin Osborne. He's Director of Programs and Advocacy at the International AIDS Society. And from Johannesburg, Anele Yawa, General Secretary of Treatment Action Campaign, the TAC. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Mr. Osborne. Looking at the big picture, millions of lives have been saved. The rate of infections has gone down basically by about 42% since 2004. Shouldn't we be celebrating, or is the worry that all these gains could be reversed greater than celebrating?
Absolutely. The concern about the future of the epidemic is really in our hands at the moment, and celebrating is far too early. There's a whole lot of work that still remains to be done. If we ever are realistically to talk about leaving nobody behind, we need to look at who those people are. In a lot of African settings, it's key populations, men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers, people who inject drugs, who are left behind. So we cannot realistically begin to talk about the end of this epidemic until we make sure that those who are facing stigma and discrimination are actually dealt with in the real course of it.
Okay. Anele Yawa, the UN declared 2030 will be the end of AIDS. That's 13 and a half years from now. I think of my 3.5-year-old daughter. That would be when she's 17 years old. It's not too long to go. She'd still be in school. Is that realistic?
Thanks for having me, firstly. And secondly, before the International AIDS Conference in Durban and after and during it and after it, we still maintain the fact that let us stop the rhetoric of talking about an end to AIDS. That is not realistic. All what we have to talk about globally is how do we fix the broken public health care systems so that they can be able to serve the interests of the poor people whose lives are dependent on the public health care system. Globally, we don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough communal care workers. People are often turned away because there are shortages of drugs and drug stockouts. So there is a lot. In South Africa, weekly there are about 2,000 new HIV infections, with a 30% of them being young girls at the age of 15 to 25 years. In South Africa and elsewhere globally, people who were initiated on ARVs are defaulting on ART treatment. Some others are lost on follow-ups. But on top of that, why do we talk about an end to AIDS, whilst we all know that the majority of poor people whose lives are dependent on the public health care system, the public health care system globally is not serving the interests of the poor people. So until such time we fix the broken public health care systems in our countries, it is only then that we can be able to talk about an end to AIDS. Just lastly, globally there are about an estimated number of about 38 million people who are living with HIV and who are in need of ARVs. Only 17 million people who are accessing antiretrovirals globally, and the 20 million or the 21 million is still in need of ARVs. So how do you begin to talk about an end to AIDS whilst there is a backlog of people who are in need of ARVs? There is a challenge of new HIV infections.
Yeah, okay.
So that is a rhetoric.
Sure, let me bring Kevin in. Kevin, so talking about those 38 million people, I mean, it's estimated between 35 and 38 million people worldwide currently living with HIV. Is that equally important to allow people to have access to those antiretroviral drugs, to give them a dignified life and a decent quality of life as well, besides trying to eradicate the disease?
Absolutely. I think the idea of managed care is an ideal that we all look about and talk about around the HIV epidemic. But managed care has to be done, as Anele has said, within a system where the healthcare system, where the providers who are providing those services, and where communities who are often at the forefront of the epidemic feel absolutely empowered to do it. So I think the idea of the end of the AIDS epidemic has really led to this idea of we've almost there. So donors have fundamentally started shifting away. People people don't think it's as important. And as long as that complacency sets in, we're going to see this resurgence that you spoke about earlier. So I think, you know, from the very beginning of this epidemic, AIDS has been deeply political. And unless we repoliticize HIV and put it at the center of our political discussions, we're going to see all the gains that we've made, all the hard-won gains that we've made over the last 30 years disappear. So this rhetoric has to be seen with a sense of absolute realism. And the questions have to be, if we are really realistically talking about the end of AIDS, where's the money going to come from? How do we fund the global fund and invest in the global fund? How do we invest in communities? Unless those questions are answered, we cannot realistically talk about the end of this epidemic.
Anele, why do you think donors are pulling out?
The reason that the donors are pulling out, it's because the donors were misled. Donors were given a beautiful picture. You know, when you paint a house outside with a nice paint and a colorful picture, but when you get inside, there's a lot of dirt. That's what is actually happening. The donors were never told that we are still not even halfway from ending AIDS. Donors were told that we are winning the war against HIV and AIDS. That's why they had to pull out. But if we can ask ourselves, out of the people who were initiated on ARVs through the public health care sector, how many of them are still on ARVs? How many of them who have died? How many of them who are lost on follow-ups? It is only then that we will realize that we are not even halfway in ending our fight against HIV and AIDS. And that's what we did as activists in Durban, was to showcase to the donors globally, to everybody, to our governments, that to talk about an end to AIDS is just a rhetoric. And the donors must continue funding civil society so that the civil society can be able to continue doing its good work that it has been doing at community level, so that we can be able to, all of us, combat the spread of AIDS, not only in public healthcare sector, but globally, also within the private healthcare sector. But also, how do we make sure that we fix the broken public healthcare system and make sure that our leaders also access health services within the public healthcare sector? Because the problem that we are faced with, people who takes policies and who comes up with innovations within the public healthcare sector, they don't access healthcare services within the public healthcare sector. So that's why, as TAC and other activists globally, we are saying after the AIDS conference 2016, we are going to start a global revolution of fixing the broken public healthcare systems.
Right. Kevin, there isn't a cure, but there are ways, better ways and means to prevent getting infected. Are you encouraged by PrEP or Truvada that's now out there, where if somebody takes it regularly, it almost acts like a vaccine and keeps people HIV-free?
Absolutely. I think there are a whole lot of prevention tools at our disposal, and PrEP is one of the latest ones and the newest ones. And it's really simple. The science is there, so we don't need to prove whether PrEP works. We just need to make sure that PrEP is available so that when people require it, they access it. That's why I think the recent decision that's been made in the United Kingdom, they've had to reverse their decision around making sure that PrEP is available within the government system, that was declared about 2 days ago, is a really good advantage, because it makes sure that people who need it can take whatever prevention tools they have at their disposal. And PrEP is a really good way of helping reduce stigma and discrimination. It's putting power in people's hands, and I think we need to make sure that those kinds of prevention tools, along with condoms, along with other known tools, are at people's disposal. But I think we need to make sure that, as the IAS, we've always said, we need to make sure that the advantages of science are placed in the hands of people. And PrEP is a really good example of where the science has now shown we can prevent new infections by using PrEP. So we need to make sure that that is in the hands of people and communities.
Yeah, Kevin, when I was in San Francisco, we filmed a lot in the Castro district among the gay community there. We did a documentary on Truvada. And what was interesting to me is that a lot of the younger men were on PrEP, and they were encouraged that this was the future. But then a lot of the older men were hesitant. They cursed the younger people who were on it. They said, I saw my friends die in the 1980s. I lived through the epidemic. You guys are idiots. You need to be careful. This is just some new flashy drug. And they were dead against PrEP. What does that tell you about the sort of generational gap and the fact that young people and older people have a very different view about how to fight HIV and AIDS.
Absolutely. I think it shows the path that HIV has come. And over 30 years, we've made some huge scientific advancements. Who thought that if we said 20 years ago, we'd be able to talk about prevention in a tablet in a lot of ways? People would have said we were mad. So I think the fact that you've got an older generation who fought many hard-won battles, and those battles have got us where we are today. They've got us having this conversation. So in some ways, the baton needs to turn over to the younger generation who are going to be the people, the generation of tomorrow, are going to be the young people and the young leaders of tomorrow who are going to take us to the supposed end of it. So I think part of that generational divide in some way is part of the amazing history and tapestry of this epidemic.
Anele, tell me about education and why, where you are, South Africa can do better in educating the public on how to keep yourself safe, but not only that, how to look after yourself if you do contract HIV.
As my brother has said earlier on, that the struggle against HIV and AIDS, we need not to romanticize it or put some roses. It is a political struggle, it needs a political intervention. But also, when you're talking about issues of prevention, as much as I support the issues of PrEP, usage of condom and all what have you, firstly, this must start from the attitude of mind. If we've got a positive attitude of mind, meaning that understanding the science of HIV and AIDS, why it is important for one to prevent himself or herself against HIV infection, I think that's where we need to start. But also, like for instance, the issue of South Africa, young girls at the age of 15 to 25 are the most vulnerable and most infected by HIV. Yet in South Africa, within schools, there is no sex and sexuality comprehensive education program. That's one of the things that we're advocating for as TAC, as to say, in order for us to be able to combat the spread of HIV and AIDS within schools, there needs to be a comprehensive sex and sexuality education as well as access to condoms. Because we strongly believe that the only way to prevent a new HIV infections is only when young people are informed, and before they do whatever, they take informed decisions. The reason that we've got a high rate of HIV infection, it is because people are ignorant. And the only way we can change that attitude of mind, it's only when we do community mobilization, we do awareness, we continue doing education, but we need to encourage continuously people to use condoms, because it is the most preventative measure at the present moment for one not to spread or to be infected by HIV and AIDS. That's why we are calling upon the South African government, especially the Department of Education and Health Department, to make sure that there is access to condoms in schools, there is sex and sexuality education in schools, not only for young girls, but both young girls and young boys, so that whatever actions they take or sexual engagements they embark on, they take informed decisions and they protect themselves from HIV infections.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately we have run out of time. Kevin Osborne and Anele Yawa. Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Sinjar's raw wounds. We visit a city previously held by Daesh and speak with Yazidi survivors. And in Picture This, chaotic scenes greet the Olympic torch's arrival in Rio. Two years ago, thousands of Yazidis were killed and captured by Daesh in what UN investigators have termed a genocide. Today, there are still thousands being held captive, according to the UN. It all started in their home of Sinjar. And while the Iraqi city has since been liberated from Daesh, people are still living with the trauma of what happened in tented camps across northern Iraq. Nicole Johnston went there and sent this report.
Sinjar Mountain. Yazidis fled here 2 years ago to escape Daesh. Now the community is living in tents, scattered across the rock, exposed to the elements. Here we meet Sadiq. He's travelling with us, back to Sinjar city and his home. But first a stop at the mountain's highest point. Driving down, there are still signs of the battle that took place here, and cars abandoned by Yazidis as they fled. At the foot of the mountain is Sinjar, or what's left of it. Everywhere you look, streets have been wrecked, houses and shops destroyed. Even the grain silos weren't spared. The battle to defeat Daesh took a heavy toll on Sinjar. It was liberated, but 80% of it was destroyed. And now 6 months later, almost nothing has been rebuilt and no one has moved home. There's no electricity. The only people in town are a few Peshmerga fighters. Sadiq's house is on the edge of the city, close to the front line.
كيف تبي وهذا زلامي عاجز زلام وكا شاغل بريته تعيشي ونهاته تعيشي يعني الفردا بهنا زقلق بزعماته.
It's still a dangerous area, so he doesn't visit often. Sadiq had a 2-story home here. His brothers and uncles had houses next door. No one lives here now. There are signs of Daesh everywhere. While the group has been removed, it will be a long time before anyone can live here, because the threat remains. Daesh is not far away. The front line between Daesh and Peshmerga is a few kilometres from Sinjar. The Peshmerga pushed the group out in December last year, but it takes a heavy military presence to protect the city from being taken once again. However, the Peshmerga are protecting more than the front line. They're also looking after this mass grave. 34 Yazidi men, women and children were lined up here, shot dead and buried.
بداية هاتن من يك جسدي السرب بعد 5-6 متر سيرفري ماديت دورة جمعية الحماية هاتن فورفيريجي وأغراض العقال دسمال بنطلون لبسي وانا ما هاد نيري مدي جمجمين وهستيد وان وغراض وان هوينا باجن هوي دري عيب قالك بيشمرقت ما بابي خوب راقي خناس كنا فيري.
It's a lonely a place of immeasurable suffering. And the families left behind are grieving, like Jamil. There's plenty of room in his tent because he's living here alone. Daesh killed 43 members of his extended family. They are buried in a mass grave.
سبب تراكتري جيش عسكري شفري بليكتي نا هم بين الراكن وبنا أردكي بيروزي مقدسي باقج وآخذ نسر.
His 5 daughters and wife are living in Germany, being treated for trauma. They don't want to go back to Iraq.
كاتشام قرتم كاتشا خكري بشيست ورقي شموسل مكري بوكام مايا بس بوكام دستة داعش ده.
There are 13 Yazidi camps across northern Iraq. Almost 175,000 people are displaced. But somehow, life goes on. And on the top of Sinjar mountain, there are some small joys for Sadiq, like his new daughter, Alia. But it's a far cry from the life he once had. Nothing has been the same since the day a band of men swept into Sinjar and declared it was part of their so-called Islamic State. Nicole Johnston, The Newsmakers.
In today's Picture This, Rio de Janeiro is ablaze with anticipation as the Olympic torch reaches its final destination. But its journey hasn't quite been smooth sailing. Let's take a look. Today's Newsmaker was the AIDS epidemic, as we asked if the world needs to rethink its approach to one of the greatest medical crises in history. The UN announced plans this year to eradicate the disease by 2030. Health experts say the goal is unrealistic and could be counterproductive, leading to complacency and a weak sense of urgency around the virus. They say hopes for an end to the epidemic are vanishing, and unless swift and realistic action is taken, it will only get worse from here. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.